Jazz. One of the most popular forms of music is known as jazz. Each year, hundreds of thousands of people attend jazz concerts and festivals in cities around the world. Jazz music, both old and new, is played on the radio and on home stereos. Two of the most important features of jazz music are improvisation and syncopation. Improvisation means that music is created spontaneously by the musician during a performance. In other words, the musician modifies some existing music in a new and interesting way. Syncopation means that the regular patterns found in music may be broken up, with new accents and uneven patterns being created. The features of improvisation and syncopation are difficult to use with skill and require great creativity on the part of the musician. Jazz music originated in the southern United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was based on African American music that was derived in part from rhythms in Western Africa. The earliest jazz musicians were influenced by a music style known as ragtime, which was popular during the late 19th century. Jazz music also incorporated some aspects of a related kind of music called the blues. By the beginning of the 20th century, a fully developed form of jazz was being played in New Orleans, a city in the southern United States. Jazz musicians played instruments such as the trumpet, saxophone, cornet, and piano. Jazz soon became popular and was played on the riverboats that traveled along the Mississippi River. Some jazz musicians moved north to the city of Chicago, and young musicians in that city developed some new forms of jazz music. By the 1920s and 1930s, jazz was popular in many parts of the United States, and some musicians began forming large bands, comprising many musicians and many different instruments. This began the period known as the Big Band era, when a popular form of jazz known as swing music was played. During the 1940s and 1950s, other forms of jazz known as bop and cool jazz were developed. Some people preferred these newer kinds of jazz, but others preferred the older varieties. By the 1960s, some jazz musicians began to experiment with different kinds of musical instruments and with other kinds of music. Some musicians incorporated musical styles from other parts of the world, or combined jazz with rock music. And today, some musicians have blended jazz with rap music. However, some people prefer the more traditional forms of jazz music. Of course, most of the great jazz musicians of the early 20th century, people such as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Dizzy Gillespie, and Billie Holiday are no longer alive. However, many great jazz musicians are still active, and many younger musicians have continued this form of music. People will continue to enjoy jazz music for a long time to come. Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin made what might be the most important scientific discovery of all time, the theory of evolution by natural selection. It was Darwin who first understood how it was that plants and animals evolved over time to produce new and different species. At first, this theory faced much opposition. But since that time, it has been supported by evidence from many areas of science. Darwin was born in a small town in England in 1809. When he was a young man, he went to university, first to study medicine, and later to study religion. However, Darwin found his schoolwork to be very boring. Instead, he preferred outdoor activities and was very interested in nature. While Darwin was at university, the British Navy was planning to send one of its ships, called the Beagle, on a voyage of exploration. As part of this voyage, the ship would need a naturalist who could study the various plants and animals that might be found. Darwin was recommended for this job by one of his professors who had been impressed by Darwin. Darwin was chosen as the naturalist of the Beagle, and the ship left England in 1831. The ship's voyage took Darwin around the world, and he observed many species of plants and animals on his trip. In one place near South America, known as the Galapagos Islands, Darwin observed many unusual species of birds. Several of these birds seemed closely related to each other, but they differed in interesting ways. For example, some birds had long beaks that could reach insects hidden in the bark of trees, but other birds had thick beaks that could break open the shells of nuts. What Darwin realized was that certain characteristics could help an animal or a plant to survive and reproduce. Individuals that lacked those characteristics would become more likely to die without reproducing. Over many generations, the useful characteristics would then become more and more common as the surviving individuals passed the characteristics on to their offspring. Eventually, after many generations, the changes would be so great that a new species would exist. In this way, a single species could divide into two or more new ones. This was called the process of evolution by natural selection. When Darwin returned to England, he studied plants and animals in more detail. After much research, he began writing a book about his theory of evolution by natural selection. When the book The Origin of Species was published in 1859, it was very popular and very controversial. During the next 20 years, Darwin continued his scientific research, and he wrote several more books. By the time of his death in 1882, many biologists had realized that Darwin had made one of the most important scientific discoveries of all time. For the first time, scientists could understand the origin of the many different species of plants and animals.